we need to question whether John was writing, let's say, this document that we call the Book of John. Did he author Jesus as God? That is, as a means of using God as a rhetorical device, or was he making the claim that Jesus was actually God? In other words, was this John actually putting forth a philosophical claim? Or was it just nuance? So many times when we hear people talk about God, it's nuance. It's just words. I stated the other day, this comes from something that I said back in 1982, and I was trying to make a point about the Abjad, that is the writing system of the Old Testament. It's a consonantal writing system in that it doesn't have any vowels. You have to point it, and there are various pointing systems that people use. One would be the Masoretic text. It's pointed one way, but you can point it 3 to 4 other ways, and they're all right. So that determines when you read the text, if you vowel point it differently, the meaning is going to come out quite differently. But one of the reasons that the Jews did this, their intent was creative process. Many people don't understand that, but creative process is all about using their documents as a means of encouraging transition. And when they did this is why a large portion of the Old Testament is written in poetic form. Many people don't understand poetic form. We're going to go through this in a few days. I'm simply going to take a chalkboard or a marker board. I now have a chalkboard again, believe it or not. Years ago, that's all I used, and then I went to a marker board, and I went through thousands of markers. But we're going to go back and try to analyze all this so people can see, the structure, because so many people are debating the book of Genesis, or better sheet. And when debating it, they don't understand the poetic structure that it is. They don't understand that the intent, namely, of the Jews was simply to create a bit of abstract art. And this means that, yes, you have permission to eisegete it. And what eisegesis is, it simply means that you're given permission, namely, eisegesis simply means to read something into the text. And that's the purpose of the Abjad. It's very much like a mystery writer. A mystery writer simply writes in ambiguity to where you can take it left or right, and it's all fine. It's all about trying to inspire, and some people are not inspired if it takes them to, let's say, place A. Some people like place B better than A. And so we see this when people are shopping for homes. One house satisfies, the other one doesn't. But when I stated back before 1982, I was having much dialogue in First and Second Temple Hebrew. I said, God is the abstraction of the idea by which people have to orient themselves to produce a functional society. And the reason that I stated that has to do with the purpose of Torah. The purpose of Torah was actually to write law, that is, to produce a functional society, civility, if you will. And so if you can orient people by using, let's say, a rhetorical device, like an Elohim or even a Yahweh, and you can do it as a means of bringing various tribes together, and in this case we're talking about 12, would that be useful? I would think so, because as many families as you have in a community, you have those many norms. And so one of the things that you find in marriage is that your wife comes from a different family, hence norm, and you bring that baggage with you as well. In other words, you have a norm that you were raised in, and you're trying to measure everything according to what you confirmed within that norm. And so confirmation bias is something that is a reality in each and every one of our lives. Now, the challenge is, can I be flexible? Can I be adaptive? Can I be functional? And so a functional society is one that has the capacity of dealing with pluralism or an issue of plurality. It's not so much of an ism, but it's an issue where we can have various ideas and no one is disparaged because someone has a different idea than you do. And so it does encourage a high level of acceptance, toleration. And so if you have 12 different tribes, they all have different norms, and within those constructs they have, thousands of norms. That's difficult to deal with. And so the Torah was not written the same way that we have our laws here in the United States written. We have a determinate nomenclature. Well, the Bible is not written in a context where we have determinate nomenclature. This is why the law first mentioned, which so many theists have practiced over the years, they will say, well, if we can define this term, its first usage, we can follow that trend all the way through the book. And many ministers of the quote-unquote gospel have followed that trend only to mess it up much, much more. And so what we do have various authors throughout Old and New Testament simply using words differently. And yes, I can say up. What are you up to? What is the direction up? Okay. The person was sent up the river and so on. I can use the word run. The person has a run in their hose. That was a good run. My father-in-law, or it's actually my uncle, his brother, and that's a weird one. I'll explain that in a few days. But he kept saying a good run is better than a bad stand. And it just makes a point when you try to get it between the left and the right ear. And so my point is, people wrote and used God in various ways. Rhetorical device, yes. When it talks about faith, that is throughout Old and New Testaments, I would challenge the notion of testament. We call them testaments. Paul writes more in the context of mystery than he does testament. And if he thought that we were talking about his writings in the context of testament, he would probably sue everyone who applied that term, simply because there's a difference between testament and mystery. And so Paul writes almost all of his epistles in the context of mystery. And so this is really something that we need to bat around. That is, if we want to understand the overall context that's in this collected, this collection of books within one book, that is the Bible. We need to understand, first of all, it is not like the church says. It doesn't have harmony. Its writings are much variegated in that they don't share a common language, style, or prose. When you read the King James Version from beginning to end, it sounds like the same guy is talking. Nothing could be further from the truth when you read the Hebrew and the Greek. And so my point is, if I'm reading the book of Revelation, I'm reading a book that sounds like it's coming from someone who didn't know Greek very well. I would say that this person is very inarticulate when it comes to Greek. It's acceptable simply because we have had redactionists clean it up, and most people don't want to go there simply because their interest isn't in what is. That goes back to eisegesis and exegesis. Eisegesis means you read something into the text. Exegesis means that there is much discipline. It's a discipline that suggests that you only take what's there and you lead that out. So if we are to talk about the text itself, let's only talk about what's there. Let's not make up things in between. And this is why I've argued for years concerning if we lack indexical and deictic elements, essential indexical and deictic elements, how can we actually do a syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis? Well, you can't. And what does that mean? It means that you can't tease out, that is, the intent, namely, of the author. And so tonight, we're going to get started talking about this person called John and his view, that is, concerning theos. And is this theos a rhetorical device? Or is it nuance? Or is it actually a God that he's trying to make a claim about? In other words, is it a theological claim? Or is it a philosophical claim? And so most of the time we spend, probably too many hours talking about theism because philosophers want something that's determinate. They want to talk about, theist, that is, let's talk about those people who are making claims. Well, the claims are not being made so much, that is, by the biblical authors. Philosophers are making a lot more claims about God than any of the authors within the biblical text. In fact, Jesus never made as many claims about God as the majority of the philosophers that you've heard on this show. This show has had many philosophers come by and state more about claims about God than Jesus ever suggested, simply because Jesus was using God the majority of the time as a rhetorical device. Why was he doing this? In order to deconstruct theology. In other words, if you're born, let's say, into a family with a norm, if you're born into a family of people that construe themselves in a certain way, they are very exclusive instead of inclusive, and they have various norms, political systems, Sadducees, Pharisees, and so on. You might want to deconstruct some things for the purposes of people getting along, and we find that Jesus is very much doing this because, some of the people, it's obvious in the text if we read it, some people didn't believe in life after death, and that was not the major sect, namely of the Jews, but it was a minor, but it wasn't that minor. In other words, we have a large number of people within the Jewish community that didn't even believe that there was life after death. And so to them, their usage of God was for the purposes of principle. And this is why I wrote, God is the abstraction of the idea by which people have to orient themselves to produce a functional society. And so they talked about God for purposes of making sure that things happen in a certain way. And before I go on, I'm going to double check something because I'm being told that we don't even have wrote God is the abstraction of the idea by which. Okay. Did you hear that? I mean, that's a post-delayed thing that came up. Okay. Someone is telling me that we don't have a clear connection. Why don't you, Diana, you or Daryl jump in for a moment and make some comments while I'm trying to figure this out.
Well, when you were making a certain statement, I thought about something that John Lennon wrote into a song. He said, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And of course, it's just his opinion. And used to, I thought it sounded kind of deep. And now I think, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But that statement, that pre-1982 statement that you just made, I think that's a pretty powerful statement. I think it's worth possibly even exegeting a little bit, explaining a little bit, because it sounds to me like something that makes a lot of sense. And I can see the value of that. I can see the sense of it. And like I said, I think it might be good just spend a little bit of time on that.
Well, what is meant, that is by me, is that when we do look at humanity, not just the Jews, we see that people are using fiction. Meinong was right in that he was a psychologist. He was attempting to explain why we author fiction that is as a parallel to our reality, because his understanding was very much like the cognitive scientists of today. He suggested that what we sense, we construct. In other words, in my brain, I don't have reality, I have a construction of reality. And when I construct reality in my brain, that is, I interpret what I sense, and that interpretation over time, it shifts. And so my interpretation, my initial interpretation of what I sensed, the data, is going to shift. And so when it comes to people who were, let's say, at an event 20 years ago, the data does go through many shifts, and that's called the reconstruction process. And so, scientists, they say, yeah, that's what happens. I mean, there's no one on the planet that doesn't do that. And so if human beings are interpreting events, that is, they sense something going on, but they interpret what they sense, and over time they reconstruct those models over and over and over again. If you have, let's say, a handful of disciples being the eyewitnesses of Jesus, and this is what, they experienced, would they not, be just normal human beings interpreting what they sensed, and over time they reconstructed, that is, their experiences gave them, let's say, reasons. I'm not saying that all reasons are good, but they did reconstruct to a degree what actually took place. And so when we look at the Bible, this book, from beginning to end, there is no evidence in it that would suggest that these individuals were trying to record accurate history. In fact, these individuals are simply putting poetic structure together for purposes of law, for purposes of inspiration. Excuse me, I've got a terrible voice tonight. But they have many things that they are trying to achieve. And I've heard so many atheists, not just theists, but so many atheists who have just tried to disparage humanity for writing lots of the things that we find within some of these books. And that's something that I don't get, because the Greeks, for instance, they had all kinds of mythologies that they wrote because they thought that through mythology they could somewhat correct the behavior, namely of their children. I don't know if you've ever studied Greek mythology, but I'm very prone to see this, because one of the things we're going to have here in just a few days, we have a young man by the name of Anthony. He's coming on the show. He has this show called Street Epistemology, in that he uses what he calls the Socratic method, excuse me. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the show The Paper Chase. Have you, Daryl?
Yes, it's been a long time, but I do remember that show.
Have you seen that show, Diana?
If it's what I think it is, yes. That was about the kids in law school?
Right.
Okay, yeah, I do remember that.
Okay, now the Paper Chase was it was a very popular movie. In fact, the professor, I think his name was Kingsfield, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken, but he claimed that he was going to use a Socratic method, and the reason that he pointed this out at the beginning was he was going to use questions as a means of getting his students to think. Now, in that methodology, it was required of them to do lots and lots of reading, research, and so they went back and forth. In other words, it was a different kind of paradigm, namely of teaching. Now, I'm going to go into a deep analysis that is on that particular methodology, I think 2 weeks from now, because I think there is much to be gained if understood. I think there is a method that we could practice, all of us, if we did something carefully. And the reason I'm choosing to do this after the show, because I want you to hear Anthony's explanation, and then I want you to see how this can be used in different ways, because I think that some people call X and Y and Z Socratic methodology, and I would pull away from that. And I don't truly think that that particular show was about a Socratic method. I think that that was the lure of the movie, and so I'm simply saying it was an interesting movie, but it really missed the point of what you can do with that particular kind of methodology. But getting back to some of the points that I was making, if I can pull this up again, back in 1982, my purpose for saying this was that so many people were parked, that is, on Protestant theology, and which is Catholic theology. Many people are not aware that the Protestants are Catholics. They are not Roman Catholic, but they are Catholic. They were called Protestants simply because they were protesting the various doctrines within the Catholic Church, one being why in the world would we want to make people within the church obligated to never marry? That doesn't make sense. Why would we want a woman to be given to be, let's say, a nun and never have a chance to be in love and have a family? That didn't make sense to people who were protesting, because they were protesting not just these issues that kept people from becoming adaptive, that is, in a social construct. And please understand, a lot of people want to make Protestantism about doctrine, correct? Are you guys asleep?
No,
Okay.
but you just brought my attention to something I never realized. Where the term nun came from, they were asked the question, how much sex have you had lately? That's terrible. I know, that's terrible. I couldn't help it. It's rare that I get anything like that, you know. I had to say it.
I mean, conduct, that is the way that people could live a bit freer. That was important to these Catholics. They were called Protestants because they were protesting the norm within the church. The church was Catholic. They never did exit the Catholic Church. However, those in Rome wanted to stay orthodox to that element in which it demands people to stay without. The protesters were saying, no, we don't want to be like that. And so no one could teach in the church if they had any kind of relationship with a woman or a man. Does that make sense? And so a lot of this had nothing to do with doctrine. It had everything to do with just family situations. And so early on, the Protestants were gaining a lot of ground simply because lots of people loved the idea that ministers, both men and women, could actually marry and do those kinds of things. That was a wonderful thing. And so
Makes a lot more sense.
I beg your pardon?
It makes a lot more sense.
It does. But Roman Catholicism was stuck. And this is the thing that, I'm shocked every time that I hear it. I hear very well-educated people saying, oh, wow, this Pope's great. And he's just, in 2018, he's just coming around to, it's all right to be a homosexual.
Yeah.
I mean, in 2018, this is where the Roman Catholic Church is. There's no hell. can't say that loudly. I mean,
Well, heck, how long did it take them to forgive Galileo?
Hello? You're making my point. So the Roman Catholic Church has always been extremely slow, sociologically speaking. That's not good. And so we can applaud the Pope because he's finally saying it's all right if people get married. But he has yet to turn to the priest, the bishops. He doesn't even allow himself to contemplate that he could be in love with a woman, another man. I mean, think about that. Think about the integrity that that would bring to the church if he would openly say, hey, listen, I have a partner. I have someone that I'm in love with. Would that not be great? But none of the popes have done that yet. None of the bishops have done that yet. The nuns are not doing that. We have a large group of people who are captured. And so the Protestant church, they walked away, and a lot of people would disparage them. And so my point is, I want people to be able to see that church hasn't always been an issue of doctrine. And the same thing would apply in Judaism. Behavior and changing behavior has always been a wonderful thing. That is, if you were trying to, change behavior for the good. And so when you go back and you read the Old Testament, the New Testament, the question is, are these people actually talking about getting saved so they can go to heaven, so they can get the ticket afterlife? If you went back and you were able to talk to Jesus, Jesus would probably say something like this: what are you talking about? We never discussed that. But that's all we hear today. And so the church, that is, during the Latin years, it changed everything. In other words, the message that Jesus was teaching, it shifted. Why? Because this was being theologically driven. It wasn't that they were trying to preserve the text. It's not like they didn't have scribes that could do so. And so my point is, when we read the book of John and we try to take the fragments that we do have, what do we actually have? And I want to read something else that's right here in front of me, simply because there is such allegiance to various isms. In other words, today we have so many people, in a sense, that have pledged allegiance to empiricism. Let me read this. Developmentally, to what extent and in what ways are we built by nature to arrive at understanding X, Y, and Z? And are we built to be initially neutral about the world we find ourselves in? That is, within the framework of expectation and classical empiricism. The point being, the manner in which we are hardwired versus what we have learned, blah, 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 perhaps should be brought into the conversation. And it was Noam Chomsky who, in a sense, revived nativism. Nativism is something that we should be willing to explore, because it's the axis on which we can look at and examine whether something is innate or not. Whereas empirical models are much different than that. I will leave that there because I would like to teach on that at some point in the immediate future, because I think that the day that we pushed nativism, that is completely out of the picture, and went with the empirical model only, I think that we lost a particular axis. And I'm not suggesting that all axes should be treated equally. I'm just saying that sometimes keeping various vantage points around for the purposes of looking at X, Y, and Z Sometimes they're very, very useful. Enough said. Now, Diana has a ball game, and I have a sore throat, and I've got a cold. I've been real, real sick. And Daryl, I think that he would like to have a good evening as well. So I'm not going to be long-winded. Do you guys, either one of you, have anything to say before I continue?
Oh, not to worry. No, I'd rather be here than at any ball game because I'll tell you, I think I told you before we went on air. I'm actually learning things here. I'm actually feeling useful, and I am so thankful to you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, in other words, she's having a ball right here. So,
Bingo.
yeah.
There we go. Okay, let's continue if we can. When I look at the book of John, and hopefully I didn't lose, I feel like tonight I'm just rambling simply because when I get to feeling this bad, I forget where I left off. So you two help me. Okay, if I go to the first part of the book of John, if I read this from the Greek text, and this is something that really doesn't have any of these textual variants in it. And some people say that textual variants are just there, and they really don't hinder at all the overall read, R-E-A-D. I disagree, simply because we have 400,000 textual variants. It doesn't mean that an inflected language, our expectation should not be, that is, in transmission, that is, throughout the years that something is preserved and you get, various documents, you're going to find a lot of spelling errors. However, some of these are not just spelling errors. Sometimes you have textual variants that very much do change the notion of what's being suggested. For instance, in Romans chapter 5:1, where it says, "Dekauthes unek pisteos." We can leave it right there and not go to the verb. In Greek, the main verb wags everything in the context. Let me turn there and I'll read this so we can look at this just for a moment. It's Romans 5:1. Okay? Because if I have a participle to kauthentes, unek pisteos, this is the issue. Is justification by faith, or is this talking about justification at all? He says, adenane ekomen. Now, the variant would be ekomen. Now, please understand when I say that when I'm talking Greek on this show and with other people, I use a certain pronunciation system that works for them because I want people to understand the difference between the Omicron and the Omega. But when you get into, if I'm speaking to someone in Greek, the Omega and the Omicron sound almost identical. The same thing is true in the first century. But when you're trying to study a language, you take a meta approach. You use a phonetic system that works to where you can see the inflection. You can hear the inflection. That's my purpose here tonight. So he says, adenane ekomen instead of ekomen. Now, the difference between echo and ekamen would be that one would be suggesting that, we possess something. We have. Most people translate adenane as peace. I would translate it as cessation of againstness. In other words, the premise of Paul's writing is to demonstrate there has never been an againstness from the framework of God. And so if you grew up with God being against you, the premise of your notion of God is wrong. Now, if I walked up to Diana and she had been condemned, that is by what other people were saying about God, and she felt condemned by God, and Paul came along and said, Diana, thinking that God has ever been against you, that's wrong. Now, you can try to argue with a person who feels condemned by God. You can try to argue with him saying there is no God. That's not going to get anyone anywhere normally. And so what you do is you approach it from a standpoint of deconstruction. And This is very much what Paul is doing. Paul is taking a deconstruction approach to the text, in that if it does read echomen instead of akamen, it simply means that he's using something in a hypothetical situation. In other words, I'm not suggesting that this is a reality, but in contrast or in juxtaposition to everything else that's been suggested, do you see the point? And so Paul seems to be the kind of author who is offering points, poetic points from time to time, philosophical points, theological points, simply to deconstruct X, Y, and Z because people felt so condemned, heavy laden, if you will. Jesus made the comment, according to the gospel writers, "Come unto me, all of you who are heavy laden," people who have so much weight on them. Notice the people who had no weight on them were the theologians of that day. They didn't have the weight. It was always these common people. It's much like what we see in the landscape of America. Those who are not of the 1%. We're always disparaged. We're always the disenfranchised. We're always the ones struggling. And Jesus could see that, and so he came to he actually went to the people and said, if you're heavy laden, come to me. I'll give you some rest. In other words, the kind of rest that he was giving them rhetoric that would deconstruct what allowed them to, in other words, I'm not going to feel condemned by people if I don't feel as if they have control of me, correct? And so if I don't give them permission to control my emotions, I might be able to feel better. Do either one of you guys understand what I'm saying here?
Oh, I do, exactly. And, it's kind of like the conversation we had about, I think it was the last Sunday night, about language being just another barrier from communication, as if the load wasn't heavy enough. And here you've got you've got life to deal with. You're at the bottom. You're not up at the top where you have everything at your fingertips. And on top of that, you've got the condemnation of, the other.
Right.
And if you can get that load off, you can at least function.
Right. So, if someone were to come my way and say, "Hey, you're stressed. You're stressed because people have been saying things and you have believed them. Perhaps I could say something that would give you the ability to let go of how you're anchored to that." And I think psychologists do a lot of this for people. They, in a sense, give people permission, that is, to let go of various isms. Sometimes we get heavy laden with a lot of that stuff. And so the point being, not all of these authors were trying to approach theology as if theology or these theological considerations of the law, the writings, or even the gospel was an end mark. They were in transition. The early epistles of Paul are not written as if Paul held the same position. In other words, he's in flux. What he's thinking today is much different than what he was thinking, 10 years into the future. The same thing is true of Chomsky. I would challenge each and every one of you, go back and read what Chomsky meant when he said generative grammar. He's changed at least 7 times. Now, is Chomsky an unreliable scientist here, Diana?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I would consider him more reliable than someone who took a stance and stayed there no matter what other information you got.
Okay, here's my point. Over time, we, all of us, between the left and the right ear, we all reconstruct what we interpreted, correct? Chomsky, when he came out with generative grammar, he has changed his mind. Darwin, if we say that we agree with Darwinian theory, today it's modern synthesis. It's not technically evolution. That is, in the context that Darwin was putting forth. We use some of it, but not all of it. Many things have been falsified. We've improved the model, correct?
Absolutely. We are
Right.
over a century ahead of what Darwin thought was going on because he didn't know a lot of the things we know now.
Right. Now, if you see paradigm shifts in a person's life, let's go back 2,000 years ago where you don't have paper and you have papyri, you don't have a computer, you don't have mechanisms by which we can record things, but you're not the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's not you. Yesterday, the way that I perceived this was different than the way that I perceive it today, and tomorrow I might change my mind. Many of the things that are written, that is, within the framework of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written in a manner in which you will see things going along. You can see a writing style, and then all of a sudden you can see, wow, that shifts. And then you see the shift of the writing style. It's not the same throughout the entire book. Now the question is why? Most of the time when we analyze people like Darrell or anyone else, we can see that they write, that is, the manner in which they use, let's say, their language is one way, and then they go through these shifts, and it's because they think about things differently. So that's one explanation, that is, of an entire document called John. Or it could be there are multiple people involved. One is suggesting, let's look at it from this standpoint, and then there's someone else. Another suggestion would be that someone is, this guy is illiterate, John, and that means that he can't read or write, and he's, dependent on, let's say, someone who can read and write to write all this stuff down. And so he has no way of verifying what was said, and so he's articulating to the best of his ability whatever, and this whatever comes out like it is, and he's looking at it and saying, well, I can't read it, I can't write it, but I can speak it. Do you follow what I'm saying? And so,
Indubitably, yeah.
now what we have within the Gospels, we have shifts, that is, of prose. This is rarely talked about. With those shifts are these multiple authors. Most people, most atheists, simply because they want to pick and bitch about the content, they would rather look at all the contradictions. Well, I can find a lot of contradictions with Chomsky, but no atheist is throwing Chomsky under the bus because they understand that over time things change, in the sense that he has a better explanation of generative grammar than he did, let's say, back in, several decades ago, correct? And we have better explanations of evolution today. This is why we call it modern synthesis. And so my point is, we don't try to disparage what we know happens with human beings and their brains. And so if these writers are trying to collect this data, and if these writers, we have no evidence, since less than 3% of the people in that day, in that area, were literate. It's unlikely, according to most, that these individuals had the ability to read and write, and so they would not have sat down and just tried to pin it out themselves. They would have been very dependent on, let's say, a secretary of some sort, a scribe, if you will, maybe several. And so all scribes don't work the same. And back in that day, it wasn't atypical for someone simply to take the gist of what you say and write it out in their own form. And that creates a completely different idea, correct? And so when people go back and they look at these ancient documents and they say, oh, look at all the contradictions, ha, 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 this can't be true, ha, 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 and so on and so on. If I were to do the same thing, that is, if we have someone in the community, we have actually a swamp here named after my family, and some of the people who have actually lived in the swamp are not very educated. I don't know if I'm related to any of them, but one gentleman, his name was actually, they named him Swamp Man because he lived on a little bitty island in the middle of the swamp, and he died, I think, about 8 years ago. One of the things that was interesting, he was a brilliant person, but he couldn't read or write. But he did share a lot of information. And a lot of the stories about Swamp Man are different. You couldn't say that they cohere. We couldn't say that they correspond. We couldn't say that there's a consensus of this gentleman. We can say that we have a lot of stories, and they are collected orally. So that's one idea. In other words, if there was a John and he conveyed all of this orally, and people took that and tried to put that together and they worked on that as a project, it might come out like what we have it, correct? But it may not come out without lots of tension and things not completely cohering. True?
True.
And so that's not a deceptive text. That's simply something that we could work with. You know, my wife, she's not inerrant, but she's extremely reliable. And so many atheists are making disparaging remarks concerning the Bible because it's not inerrant. Now, I get that the fundies are trying to suggest that the Bible is inerrant, but those are the fundies. People who, in the theistic world, theologians are not making those claims. Now, and this is the thing that I don't understand about major league atheists. Always, let's take on someone who believes in a flat earth. Let's call up Eric Hovind's father and see if we can debate him about biology. I mean, why should I try to find somebody walking down the road that's a local drunk and debate him, that is, on linguistics, Diana?
Right. I mean, that drunk knows absolutely zero.
But for some reason, people are entertained by that kind of mindset. Why?
Yeah, I get the feeling that people like adversity. Right now, there's a stream going on another channel where Aaron Ra's debating a flat earther, and I've heard this flat earther. He's got his own channel. The boy knows absolutely nothing, and he's going to get totally shredded.
Okay, but why embarrass someone? I don't get that. You know, when the purpose of me going through the Bible has to do with, I want to do my best, that is for atheists and theists alike, to destroy this mindset of fundamentalism that is in the context of the Bible, because theologians don't think that way. The only ones who do, people want to stay away from them. If you give them airtime, it's going to go south for everyone. Do you see where I'm coming from? And so I don't think that if you entertain the trolls, I don't see any value in that. And I understand that a lot of people like to laugh at other people, but that certainly isn't humanism, is it?
No, it's to me it's more like the Colosseum.
Right.
You know, the gladiators going at each other, preferably totally unmatched. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm eventually going to have a look at that stream and see just how bad it is, but I don't expect to learn anything from it.
No, But my point is, I'm offering many possibilities of how the book of John could have come about. The same thing was true with Matthew. When we read some of the Gospels, we have this Q-text thing going on, the qual, it's called. And to measure that out is fascinating, but it doesn't mean that it isn't synthetic. In other words, we're dealing with possibilities here, okay? And so my point is, when we're going through the book of John, teasing out the intent of the individual himself is difficult. Why? Because first of all, we may not have his very words, correct?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so we may be reading, that is, within all of these fragments, what the copyist gave us. That's it. And so I'm not one who articulates an argument that says that we do have an autographa. That is, let's say we've reconstructed something that would look identical to an autographa. There's nothing that would suggest that John produced an autographa. Now, some do think that John produced this text, but their argument is weak. But I would rather keep it on the table than just to push it off. Simply because if John just gave this and said, hey, you like the story that I'm telling? Let me tell this to you. You write it down. I'm just going to have to trust you. I can't read. You can. That could have happened. But we know that this is something I was talking with Bob Graves about the other day. I said, sometimes I think that people don't understand the difference between oral and written form. I can speak to you all day long, and we can have a great conversation and get along. But if the only thing that you knew about me was in written form, I don't think that you would perceive me to be the same person that I am. In other words, the manner in which we interpret people based upon writing is much different than seeing them face to face in oral conversations. This is why I make a lot of noise about non-linguistic elements. In other words, when I'm talking to you, you can see my gestures, you can see whether I give a damn or not. And most people think I'm a good person simply because I am a good person. I'm a wonderful person. But most people can't see that. That is through some of the things that I might type out. That is, let's say, in a Facebook comment. And so they're looking at, written form, and they're trying. I mean, surface language can go left or right. Okay, how many people read something into someone else's comment? Does that happen often?
I do it, yeah.
Okay, let's presuppose that John, he was telling all of this stuff to someone. This person's writing it down, and they said, "Hey, hold it! I don't have a pen. I don't even have a piece of paper. Hasn't been invented yet. I have papyri." It's almost like writing on a dried out corn shuck. It takes a long time. And so by the time that, you're trying to dictate something, you forget your place, because this guy, he's not used to doing any of this. Do you see where I'm coming from? And so this is not, we don't have these perfect memories of what took place. And so John is struggling, and someone else is saying, I know how to be literate here. Very good. John is written in third grade Greek. What John may have articulated could have been very sophisticated, but the writer that collected the data from John, his ability in Greek may not have been any better than third grade Greek, correct? And so, did he write exactly what John said? We have no evidence that in many cases, not just biblical manuscripts, but extra biblical manuscripts, we have no evidence that that was actually a common practice, that is, to write verbatim of any quotes or anything like that. In legal documents, we have an invested interest in some of those things, but I mean, they are very, very sloppy. And so I spent years in classical Greek and reading through that. When I hear what people are saying about Aristotle and Plato and all those, and about, the Greek plays, and for the record, about 2 weeks from now, after we do the show with Anthony, I'm going to get into some of the Greek plays and the course and all that kind of stuff and what's happening, simply because I want to discuss Socratic methodology. I think that it's very useful, but I don't think that at the end of the day what one wants to do with it is to convert people by that method. I think that it was designed for the purpose of both teacher and student, if in a learning environment, to both learn at the same time. The peripatetic philosophers use this method, and Paul speaks about it in Galatians. It's a fantastic thing if anyone's ever done any kind of exegesis in the latter parts of the book of Galatians. That's a fascinating read. When I read it, I go, wow, Paul is really going wild with how the Greeks used plays. He almost introduces the course. This is wonderful theater, and I enjoy it a lot. But when you read it in English, it's as if, wow, you have the dictates of God here. That's so far away from the truth, it's unreal. And so there's an advantage of being able to read it. There's a difference between people being illiterate and not. There's a difference between people who can fluently go through the languages and people who can't. People who are English only, their approach to the Bible. And so the rhetoric that you hear in atheism and theism is mostly English only trash for the most part. And so we have so many people, taking these shots and jabs at the Bible, saying, look at all of the contradictions, but they've never considered, they've never tried to exegete it. They've never tried to say various things could have been done, and let's deal with what's there and the possibilities of how this was constructed. Am I making any sense to either one of you?
Oh, indeed. That whole oral form to written form thing, you lose so much. One thing that comes to my mind, in July, I'm going to have my annual celebration. As it turns out, I turned 12 the day Neil and Buzz landed on the moon. So I've collected the audio tapes from the mission, the written transcripts that were produced at the time of the mission. And you look back and forth between those two, and there's a lot you miss because, okay, the transcripts are in a linear form, whereas the conversation was in parallel. You had 4 guys talking, 3 of them out in space, 1 of them down on the ground, and sometimes they would talk over each other, and that would modify the conversation. Sometimes the transcript typists would miss a few things. It didn't totally change what they were talking about, but you could see areas where things didn't quite line up between the tapes and the written transcript. And this was only 49 years ago.
Right.
Think of the big differences you have with a 2,000-year-old text.
Right. Okay, I'm reading one comment. It said the globe Earth behind Dr. Jones is inaccurate. Let me get it for a moment. That's it. But my question, is this inerrant, inaccurate? Does it have a lot of contradictions to it?
Well, for one, if that's what I think it is, I can't taste what's in it.
That's the lure tonight. Okay, it's tasty and old. Okay, let me read just a bit of John. And you tell me when you guys want to quit. I'm very sloppy tonight, by the way. John chapter 20, verse 28, there's a portion of this text that reads this way: Ha kurios mu kai ha theos mu. It's obvious when most people read this, they say the Lord of me and the God of me. And many people would wonder why the Jehovah's Witnesses are trying to make an argument as if, if Thomas actually knew Jesus, why would they want to disparage this usage of, let's say, theos in John chapter 1, verse 1? In other words, it reads, in archein halagos kai lagos ein proston theon kai theos ein halagos. Simply because theos, kai theos, doesn't have a definite article, they translate it as the word was God. And so here, one of the arguments theologically that most people make to deify Jesus as being the very God that the word is with in chapter 1 has to do with this particular passage. It's called a proof text for John 1:1. That would be John 20, verse 28. Ha kurios mu kai ha theos mu. Now, there are various ways of looking at this. This author could have been calling him the Lord of me. It could be translated, kurios can be translated in Greek, that is in Koine Greek. He could be saying the gentleman of me, my gentleman, in other words. The God of me, that wasn't atypical. Caesars or Khazars, they were called gods. They became gods if they did something that is for the sake of civility in a community, or if they left a legacy, they were referred to as God. That wasn't a crazy idea for them. It was in the context of being remarkable. And so I call my wife God all the time. She loves it. I do as well. So the question would be, is the language, or rather the intent of John, is there any evidence that everything that he's saying concerning theos, is he talking about a literal God like people are when making the philosophical claim that they do theistically? So what are your thoughts on that, Diana?
Well, I missed a little bit of that because I ran and turned my coffee maker off.
Okay.
So if you could run over, say, the past 20 or 30 seconds of that.
Perhaps I forgot.
Oops.
Well, I'm simply saying.
Now we have a disparity.
No,
we have a disparity going here.
Okay, I do have a problem tonight. I'm pooped, not feeling very well, and I do forget. I was just making the point. So many people, this verse can be translated ha kurios mu kai ha theos mu. It can be translated the gentleman of me, or in other words, my gentleman. And it wasn't atypical for people to call, let's say, a Caesar God if they were remarkable, doing something meaningful that is within the community. There was a legacy of God left to them, for there to be a, let's say, someone makes a statue of an individual, that's not atypical, is it? For them to, in a sense, worship or deify them or place them up here as if this is a very important one, that wasn't atypical. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, could that be simply, well, I don't have the word, a way of showing great respect?
Right.
This was a great teacher. You are, whatever he would have said at that time, that got translated to, my God,
Right.
my Lord.
So the point that I'm making is, if Jesus would have been remarkable to these individuals, and let's say after his death, they wanted to nuance something they may not wanted to come out with explicitly, I reject Yahweh. But they could reject Yahweh by saying Jesus is God. In other words, with the conditions that were within Judaism, to explicitly disparage Yahweh would be a violation of the Mosaic Law, correct?
Oh, absolutely. That could get you in
Okay.
a lot of trouble.
Now, this would have been extremely ambiguous, or even a situation to where they could get by with. In other words, what you did with a person who did nothing but just try to love people. In fact, when you went to him and tried to stone a woman caught in the midst of committing adultery, he said, if you're without sin, please pick up a stone and throw it. And so they didn't stay around. And then the story goes, he turned to the young lady. He didn't say, I'm going to die for your sins. He didn't say, hey, I condemn you. No, he says the opposite. He says, I don't condemn you. He didn't say, I find fault with you. And so the thing that brought her to that moment, that event, was her belief in a theology, right?
Yeah.
And so her belief in that theology needed to be deconstructed. It's unfortunate that translators have mistranslated that passage. It doesn't read in the Greek, go and sin no more. That passage demonstrates the thing that brought you here was the theology of sin. Right?
Okay, I can go with that.
Okay. If you didn't have a theology of sin, if you didn't have a theology of stoning people who do things that you wouldn't do. In other words, think about the context. Women were treated as chattel, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
And so Jesus comes along and he's for Christian marriage, by golly, right? I mean, come on, let's think about it. Oh, hey, I'm for Christian marriage, okay? Even if your husband bought you, stay with him. You're obligated to him until he dies. And someone might have caught her in the midst of making love with someone she was really in love with. If Jesus had known that people were trying to get away from the person who treated them like chattel to go find someone who really loved them, would not he have said, I don't condemn you? The only reason that you're here, it's because you really have submitted, namely, to the theology of sin?
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that passage, that story may have been a later insertion, but it may still be in line with what was going on. And the way I am understanding what was going on at the time is these people were very much of the mind that their God was going to rain all manner of horrible things upon them if they broke the laws. And what I think I'm getting, correct me if I'm wrong, please, this Jesus character may have been saying, no, that's not quite it.
Right.
I mean, they were going through a time where, heck, the entire society was falling apart around them,
True.
and they're thinking that, hey, our God is giving us the punishment we so justly deserve, and maybe he's saying, no, you really didn't. You're not deserving of this punishment. Your God is not doing that to you.
Right.
Am I getting that?
Sure. In other words, once you take, let's say, their ultimate belief is in God, you can't go there. That's a no-no. But you can certainly challenge everything underneath it. For instance, let me tell you a story that, if it happened like this or not, I don't know, but it's a story that's useful. Two pilots in the cockpit. One was a co-pilot. The other one was the pilot. The co-pilot said to the pilot, "We need to look at this instrument. It's suggesting something here." The pilot didn't pay it any attention at all. The co-pilot, a few minutes went by and said, "Hey, listen, the instrument, let's look at this. Let's analyze this." And the pilot just ignored it. The co-pilot said, "Oh, could you check this instrument, please?" Then they hit the side of a mountain, and it exploded, and it killed all of them. From what I understand, this story is true. And it's true about some people who live in a country that is a Korean country, where they teach authority that's way up here. They have a hierarchy that's way up here. And so if you're a co-pilot, you don't feel like you have a right to say, "Hey, we're going to die if you don't look at this instrument. I mean, something's wrong here." Do you see where I'm coming from? The Socratic method.
Yeah.
Okay, the Socratic method is, in a sense, the only good thing that I saw in the paper chase was when the guy really got upset with the professor. He finally said, "You son of a bitch." I mean, when he finally got honest with the professor, and he thought that he was being thrown out of that semester completely, but the guy said, that was the best thing said today. And I think the professor in the setting was trying to say, the Socratic method is to get you to the place to where you feel as if you have something to say. Whether it be right or wrong is secondary to the point. And so the reason for the Socratic method was to have a conversation. You can bounce the ball back and forth, and both the student and the teacher can learn at the same time. Make any sense? And people are not Socratic today. They would rather, I'm on an airplane, I'm the co-pilot, I see an instrument, we're out of fuel, hello, we're not going to make it, something's wrong. Some people are afraid. I don't know, there are a lot of examples that I'd like to give. I mean, in psychology, they've done studies like this when it comes to lines. All of them are different. And you can take, I think they took 9 people, if I'm not mistaken, and they arranged it to where all of them would say, they had 10 people, but 9 of them were going to say that all of the lines are the same way. And so when they looked at the lines, and all of these lines are different, but 9 of them say, oh, they're all the same. 2/3 of the time, the one who was excluded, that last one, would say, after he heard the 9, yeah, they're all the same. Only 1/3 of the people that the test was actually for concluded something's messed up here.
Yeah, I think I know the experiment to which you're referring. I
Right.
cannot
Now, I
bring
may
up the
not be telling
citation,
it.
but I do know it.
Right. I don't know that I'm telling it as it is, but I think that I've made the point with it. And so my understanding of the text is that this is a little bit more complex than atheist for the most part. And I'm talking about the average atheist, because I've been into this for a long, long time. And when I hear the rhetoric of all of these major players in atheism, I don't hear people taking a measured approach, that is, to documents. I've never seen such a poor illustration of an approach to any kind of evidence. In other words, when you're looking at manuscript evidence, you don't speak like a Richard Carey or a Price. I mean, these guys are trying to disparage. They're trying to throw things under the bus. That's not what people do when dealing critically with evidence. I don't have an opinion, that is, on what the likelihood is of many, many verses, because I'm painfully aware that we lack so many things within the framework of the essentials to even reconstruct that. And so I have to suspend judgment. Working with lexical theory, for instance, John Lee, Ann Nyland, and others have made it clear that the manner in which lexical theory, that is, of Koine, has been approached has been a failed approach completely. And so now everything, every lemma, everything is on the table in question. Now, accidentally, we may be right on some things, but if you use a failed methodology, you're going to have to go back, and it takes years to undo this, correct?
Yeah, if you're going to do it at all.
Right. But that doesn't stop atheists from bashing the text. That doesn't stop debates from going on where people are defending something that we don't even understand. People insulting something that we don't understand yet. And so please tell me, Diana, how, if we don't really have a good methodology, if things have been falsified, if we have so many things that we lack, how can we say anything left or right concerning a document if what I'm suggesting is true?
Well, you really can't say anything about the document. I mean, the feeling I get, I've probably said this more than once before, is that the major players, the major atheists, are more attacking the politics of the day here in the U.S. than they are attacking the documents, but they're going about it the wrong way. They're kind of confusing the things that the fundamentalist church is doing here with the message that those fundamentalists are misusing. Maybe if they tried to understand the message a little better, they could do a little better as far as ameliorating the problems that we do have with the very far right Christians.
Right. Daryl, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely see the problem that we have. Just kind of goes back to the willingness of people to address it in the proper manner, to really approach it the way it needs to be approached.
I think you were more interested in me talking about the abstraction of the idea by which people have to orient themselves to produce a functional society than anything tonight, were you not?
Well, yeah, that definitely caught my attention. I'll admit that.
Well, it did because, if and when, and I will get into it, I want to go back and demonstrate that if you're going to have a functional society, there are different methods and practices that one could orient, namely the masses, to and with. And we can do this with things that we perceive to be above us. In other words, if we can have, let's say, the National Football League, okay, carries a lot of weight when it comes to playing football. But at the end of the day, who has the right to say that football has to be played the way that they play football today? Do you see where I'm coming from? In other words, people simply get together and they develop rules based upon a consensus, blah, 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 and people are making a lot of money. But if someone introduced something that's just off the wall and said, why don't you put this in football? Something that's just out of the ordinary, I would bet that it wouldn't get in there, would it?
Not in this country. Maybe in
Right.
Australia. They've got Australian rules football, and I'll tell you, that's crazy. It's a lot more fun watching that than watching NFL.
I guess my point is, when I look back in the day in which I played basketball, we couldn't take as many steps, that is, toward the net as they do today. Pistol Pete Maravich, I met him years ago. He was a very good player, by the way. He could dribble the ball, but he couldn't take as many steps as they do today, and much of this is done in the name of entertainment. However, the basketball players today make Pistol Pete look like he couldn't even play basketball. I mean, we have some fascinating basketball players. Are either one of you into basketball?
Yeah, I enjoy it, and I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there's some talent out there.
King James, I tell you what, that guy, when you look at his stats, I mean, that guy is brilliant. I mean, he's awesome. I mean, I don't know that there were. I truly don't know whether there will ever be a better player than him. I mean, he's great. I used to think that Allen Iverson, for his size, wow, I was just impressed with him. He could put the ball in at such weird angles. I mean, he had a gift. I mean, the guy was just brilliant. But I don't know, what you see going on today is very real. And this is the point back to the book of John. You find brilliant people, you admire them. And people who are really into basketball, and I'm not, but I do love the game, they develop a mindset, this guy is, he's king, and they speak about him in a very great way. And I'm not convinced that some of these writers within the biblical text are like that. I don't think they had any intent of becoming a part of the Christian narrative. I think if they were alive today, they would be upset and suing somebody. But I don't know. That's just me, maybe. But I think that I'm doing a little bit better when it comes to critical exegesis than what we see in the great debate. You guys are going to have to fill in.
You're talking about basketball. I take it that you probably have no idea what my game is. But
Well, yeah, I can't tell by that cap and it's hard to tell. You know what? I tell you what. Let me brag about Texan here just for a little bit. I had no idea Nolan Ryan did what he did. That guy was one of a kind. No one will ever catch him.
He changed pitching single-handedly, and I don't know that it was for the better, to tell you the truth.
Well,
Um,
he was unstoppable. He was so accurate with his pitches that batters couldn't hit off of him. I don't know how you can pull it off, but
and then he had a cannon for an arm. I mean, he routinely threw over 95 miles an hour, and then suddenly you start seeing speed over location. I appreciated, I lost his name, Jim Palmer, who could make the ball do such amazing things. And that seems to be lost. I don't know. But this isn't ESPN, so where were we?
but
Oh,
we can tell
boy.
you something. I'll put it.
I don't know, but this ball.
Oh,
The ball, all right.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the ball thought experiment. I've authored about 20 different thought experiments over the last couple of months, and I want to get into them. I want to return to the ball. I think it's fascinating. Bob and I love getting into these kinds of discussions, and so we enjoy it. Skeptical Jed, I like his orange and yellow hair. Okay, yeah. Sometimes my hair is white. It actually is white. It's orange and yellow simply because the guys have accomplished a different color balance on the quote unquote camera. It's unfortunate.
speaking of baseball, I've got to add this. This was quite unique. It's a first for me. I went to a funeral today, and when generally when they take the casket out and the family follows, that's when people usually get tearful and they play in a somber song and everybody really gets emotional. They did it a little different today. They played the song Centerfield by John Fogerty, and it was kind of nice. It was the guy that had passed away was big into baseball, and so it was his favorite song. So they played his favorite song and just kind of lightened things up. It was actually kind of nice.
I need to take back my comment, I guess. They were not talking about my hair. They were talking about Donald Trump's hair.
Okay.
Oh, boy. I tell you what, I'm not feeling very, very well. I mean, I'm just out of it. Oh, boy. I don't know. My wife and
You gonna want to
I
wind down soon?
beg your pardon?
You're gonna want to wind down soon. I mean, you don't
I'm
want to
I'm
exhaust
ready to
yourself
go.
here.
Jack keeps saying we need to sign off, and probably everything that I said this evening was crazy. And one of the things that I love about NCG is that I can be as crazy as they come, and people still are going to be kind and patient with me, and I'm so thankful for that. And so hopefully we can pull things together and do a better show on John. We didn't even get to the point that I wanted to get to tonight, and so please
Oops.
forgive me. Yeah, it's weird. There's a part of me that says just keep working. And my grandfather, by the way, he had the philosophy. He said, when you're sick, keep working. So when you get well, you can go to bed and rest. And that's something that I've always done. And so it's weird, but it's very difficult to talk right now. And so thank you for all your kind words and all of that. And I would like to make a point. I'm very, very thankful for all of the atheists who have come our way. I've learned so much from them. I'm thankful for the theists as well. I think if we learn how to work together instead of working against each other, I think that we can get from A to B a lot quicker. If I say something about someone doing X, Y, or Z, I'm not trying to disparage them, and if I do, please forgive me, but I think that we can do things in a much better way, and I think we can practice using better approaches to the text, that is, better approaches to this and that, and I think life will be much better for not just us, but for our children and grandchildren. They are worth it. All of the time, effort, money that we spend today, let's not spend it on self. Let's invest, that is, in people. Let's invest in our children. Let's invest in our grandchildren, because they don't deserve to inherit all of our baggage. If you're like me, if you were raised being indoctrinated, I feel like at times that's all I have is indoctrination. And you guys are the ones pulling that out of me, and I'm so thankful. But I don't want to give that baggage to my children and my grandchildren and so on. I want to, build a wall that stops that stuff from going any further. And so my craziness needs to stop, and I don't want my children to inherit that. And so with that said, we're out of here. Good night.